To say that the Swedes ruled the Goths at this time would be inaccurate. Sweden didn't really have one permanent capital, nor one center of power, but three. Svealand, Västrogothia and Ostrogothia held the realm and its people united together. Without the help of the other two, they wouldn't have been able to rule their own lands, and Sweden would have collapsed. The kings of Sweden at this time didn't live in one castle, but often traveled between the three regions, enforcing their rule as best they could. Sweden was vulnerable and weak, so in 1060, when King Inge the Old died and left no heirs, Sweden was ready to once again shatter into pieces, and would have, had one man not claimed the kingdom for himself. This man was the Västrogothian lord Stenkil Ragnarsson, who legitimized his rule by marrying the daughter of the late king. The rule of King Stenkil was relatively short, but significant nonetheless. Thanks to him, Svealand and Gotland remained united under one royal house. One could also argue that it was Stenkil who secured the earldom of Värmland for Sweden. Despite its central location, the Goths of Värmland was shielded on all sides by dense forests and had thus managed to maintain their independence as vassals of the Swedes. But its unfortunate location between Norway and Sweden resulted in constant outside interference, and the allegiance of Värmland had always been doubtful, to say the least. But during the rule of King Stenkil, the Värmlandians chose the Swedish side when Harald Hardrada of Norway invaded Västrogothia. Harald sailed up the river of the Goths, or Göta Älv, and defeated the Swedish-Gothic army in a naval battle on Lake Vänern. When he sailed back down, however, Gothic archers from Värmland fired on the exposed Norwegians, causing heavy casualties. Harald would never invade Sweden again. Värmland had chosen the Swedish side, and her allegiance were never doubted again. In fact, despite once being a Gothic kingdom, Värmland is today part of the Swedish heartlands, Svealand, and not Gothland. Anyways, now once again, Svealand found itself ruled not from Sigtuna, but from Västrogothia. This was barely tolerable under the reign of King Olof, and even less so with the Västrogothian King Stenkil. And so, when the king suddenly died of fever in 1066, a civil war broke out between the Odinist Swedes and the Christian Goths. The leaders of the two factions were both named Erik, but history remembers them as Erik the Pagan and Erik Stenkilsson. According to the sagas, the two Eriks waged a terrible war on each other, with disastrous consequences. It is said that all the magnates of Sweden fell in less than 1 year as a result of the war. Erik the Pagan and Erik Stenkilsson both died in 1067, fighting each other, after which the war more or less ended and Sweden was once again kingless. Halsten, the son of Stenkil, claimed the throne, and thus history had once again repeated itself. After all the horrors of the civil war of the Eriks, Sweden was still ruled from Västrogothia by a Västrogothian king. To the Swedes, being ruled by a Christian Goth was unacceptable, but starting another civil war was even worse. So instead, the Swedes simply deposed the king and called Lord Anungårdske from Russia to serve as king. And so, Sweden had a new king, just like that. Okay, it wasn't that simple, of course. Halsten was described by the Goths as a polite and happy king, and so the Westrogoths refused to accept this strange Russian king, even though he was Christian. Besides, King Anund refused to carry out the public sacrifices to the Norse gods at Uppsala, and so less than a year after he was crowned king, he too was deposed. Ironically, he fled to Västrogothia. The Westrogoths elected a new king of Sweden, Håkan the Red, but in reality he only ruled Västrogothia, while the Ostrogoths and the Swedes mostly ruled themselves. In 1075, the last Viking kingdom was proclaimed when the pagans in Uppland declared independence from their Christian king. When Håkan the Red died around 1079, he was succeeded by Inge the Elder, the son of Stenkil. Inge was slightly more accepted by both the Goths and the Swedes, and was able to rule Sweden together with his brother and the previous king, Halsten. Inge ruled from Ostrogothia, while Halsten most likely ruled from Westrogothia. After a few years of peace, Inge became the sole ruler of Sweden, with the exception of Uppland. The king understood that the Swedes had to be Christianized if the realm was to survive, and so that became his main goal during his rule. Christianity was now the main religion in Svealand, but many still held to the old traditions as well. Pagan holidays were still celebrated regularly, especially in Uppsala. But when Inge refused to take part in these pagan sacrifices, the Swedes gave him an ultimatum: perform the sacrifices or abdicate. Inge chose the Christian way and returned to Westrogothia, and the Swedes elected Sven the Sacrificer as the new king. Sven's rule was not to last, however. After 3 years as king of Sweden, Inge returned to Svealand and killed him. Legends has it that Erik Orsel, the son of Sven, claimed his father's title after that, but was killed the following year. Inge continued his work in Svealand and was largely successful. He ruled until he died of old age, around the year 1100. His nephew, Philip Halsten's son, reigned after him. A few years into Philip's reign, his brother Inge the Younger was crowned king as well, and together they ruled Sweden until the death of Philip in 1118, after which Inge the Younger remained as the sole ruler of Sweden until his death around 1125. Inge the Younger was the last of the House of Stenkil, and so the lords of Sweden had to elect a new king. The Goths chose Magnus Nilsson, who was the grandson of Inge the Younger through the female line, and son to King Nils of Denmark. In retaliation, the Swedes chose their own king, Ragnald Knaphövde. Ragnald was killed less than a year later, however, and Sweden was once again united under Magnus. Magnus I claimed legitimacy by being of the House of Stenkil, although in truth he wasn't, and everybody knew this. Magnus was of the Danish House of Estridsen, and thus a contender to the Danish throne as well. In 1131, Magnus had his cousin and potential rival to the Danish throne murdered. This sparked a civil war in Denmark, which weakened the Gothic support for him. Of course, the Goths didn't want to fight a war for the Danish throne, and so they abandoned him, and chose an Ostrogothic lord as their king instead. Magnus died in Scania 3 years later, fighting his civil war. After 65 years of civil wars and dynastic disputes, and with the end of the House of Stenkil, Sweden now had an opportunity for a fresh start, to make Sweden united and strong as it was in the days of the House of Uppsala. Sweden had been ruled from Gotland for over a century now, and the Swedes had managed to maintain their hold of Svealand. But as the Swedish-Gothic conflicts were ending, the Gothic civil wars were about to begin.